It's the Brian Lehrer Show. I'm producer Amina Serna, filling in for Brian today. We're joined now by Nahal Toosi, senior foreign affairs correspondent and columnist at Politico. Her recent column argues that the Trump administration is increasingly willing to carry out military strikes against Cuba in a significant escalation from the economic and diplomatic pressure campaign that had prevailed in recent months. Her piece was published on Sunday. Then, in the 48 hours since, two major developments appeared to confirm the trajectory she described. On Tuesday, President Donald Trump's Justice Department unsealed a federal indictment of 94-year-old former Cuban President Raul Castro on murder charges related to a 1996 shooting down of a plane piloted by 4 Americans. CBS News reported that the Pentagon and Defense Intelligence Agency have begun developing military operations for the president. So the question might no longer be whether Cuba is in the Trump administration's crosshairs, but rather what comes next. Nahal joins us now. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So the headline of your Sunday column was pretty blunt. Quote, yes, Trump might really attack Cuba. We'll get into what sources have told you is on the table in terms of military options. But first, this comes after several months of the U.S.'s pressure campaign against Cuba. We've reported on that on this show before, how the U.S.'s oil blockade has devastated the island. A New York Times contributor recently referred to the situation as a, quote, man-made humanitarian crisis. So first, can you put this into context for us and why the Trump administration doesn't think its campaign is working?
Yeah. So, if you'd asked me just 2, maybe 3 months ago, whether the administration was willing to use military strikes or was going to, I would have said no. My sense of things at the time was they went into this definitely wanting a major change in Cuba, but trying to approach it through diplomacy and economic pressure. Now, the U.S. has long had essentially an embargo on Cuba, numerous sanctions, lots of restrictions, and the Trump administration ramped that up from the beginning of its tenure. And then this year, we saw them ramp it up even more. So after the operation in Venezuela, they effectively cut off fuel shipments to Cuba, essentially putting an energy blockade on Cuba. But at the same time, they were talking to the Cubans, sometimes through intermediaries, but these back-channel conversations. And the goal originally seemed to be to see if they could get the leadership to make significant, major economic reforms on the island and some political changes. And then you kind of saw the messaging shift over time to where they were increasingly emphasizing the need for political change because they were growing really frustrated with the regime and their unwillingness to really come to terms with the situation on the island economically. And they just were not... They were stubborn, in the words of some sources. And then you just more recently, and this is where I detected very much a vibe shift, is the sense that, look, these guys are not going to play ball. Economically, politically, diplomatically, anyway, we have to use some sort of force, or we may have to. And I just feel like the reality now is they're much more willing to use force than they would have been 2-3 months ago.
2 days after your column was published, Trump's Department of Justice unsealed a federal indictment of former Cuban President Raul Castro. They included 7 counts, including conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals and murder related to the 1996 Brothers to the Rescue shootdown. For listeners who aren't familiar with that 1996 event, what is the U.S. accusing Castro of?
Basically, the Brothers to the Rescue were a group of Cuban-American exile types in the U.S. who sent out these planes, these Cessnas, unarmed, is my understanding, to rescue Cubans who were trying to flee the island by boat. And basically, in the past, the Cubans had warned that they were not going to allow these flights to enter their airspace. There was definitely a lot of um, dispute. So exactly what happened. But the Cubans did shoot down a couple of these planes, killing four people, three of them American citizens. One, I believe, was a US resident. And that, really infuriated the Cuban diaspora in the United States. But the US government, for a variety of reasons, political reasons, et cetera, over time, had not officially indicted Raul Castro, who was the head of Cuba's defense establishment at the time.
Hmm.
And now Raul, who is the brother of the late Fidel Castro, the dictator, and he himself had been president of Cuba for many years. He's now technically in retirement, I guess you could say. And he's 94, almost 95. And the US unveiled this indictment accusing him of murder and a number of other crimes. And it's, again, part of this pressure campaign. But what this also did was that it reminded people of what the US did to Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro,
Hmm.
in which they unveiled an indictment, an updated indictment, I should say. We'd indicted Maduro years earlier on drug trafficking and other charges, and basically said, we've never recognized Maduro as Venezuela's rightful leader. He's just a narco terrorist. He's under indictment. And what we're going to do in Venezuela is carry out a law enforcement operation, take this guy into custody and bring him to New York, where he's now on federal trial. And so this situation reminded people of that. And so it raises the question of, is the US possibly considering a similar playbook for Raul Castro, unveiling this indictment and possibly going in for a capture operation?
Right. And I was reading online as well that this indictment of Raul Castro actually came down from the courts at the end of April, actually, and wasn't revealed until this week. What is the significance of the timing of that? Why the delay?
Well, the Justice Department has many cases like this where they have sealed indictments, cases on the shelf, indictments that they could pursue, but they don't because it's not a priority or whatever. This became a political priority. And so my sense is I can't say I have reporting to back this up, but I've done reporting on the Justice Department on these types of issues in the past, and I've seen this pattern. My sense then is that the administration said, okay, time to move on the Castro case. They got the sealed indictment, but remember, they were still pursuing diplomacy. They were still trying to see if there were other avenues to deal with the Cubans. And so they kind of kept this in their back pocket and decided to unveil it at a time when they felt like it could be useful as leverage. Raul, although technically retired, is still a powerful figure in Cuba, and he has a grandson and other relatives who have influential positions and figures and can act as conduits to the regime. But I will say, Raul also inspires a lot of loyalty among Cubans, and going after him might not exactly thrill many Cubans, and it might not exactly be a huge flex of power to go after someone in his mid 90s. At the same time, if you committed a crime, your age doesn't get you out of accountability.
Listeners, we're talking about the growing possibility of U.S. military action against Cuba. If you have family on the island, or if you're Cuban American, part of that diaspora, give us a call now and share your thoughts. Maybe you're a veteran who has thoughts about the U.S. opening another front. We also want to hear from you, or anyone else who has comments or questions as the Trump administration looks to potentially engage militarily in yet another nation. Give us a call now at 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can also text that number. Nahal, you report that the Pentagon isn't just thinking about grabbing one or two individuals, that planners are weighing a range of options. So how wide is that range?
It could be really wide. It is. It is really wide. I mean, Cuba is 90 miles off of Florida's coast. It has a military, and the entire Cuban population is in some ways trained to act in defense if attacked. But it is an incredibly weak institutionally right now. Even the military right now is degraded. They have power cuts of like 20, 22 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
They are hungry. They are incredibly weak. Now, you could do anything from a quick snatch and grab. You could carry out a missile strike on some Cuban facility just to send a message and just to see if the regime might react to that. Or you could go all out and send in ground troops. I would be surprised if they went that far. Or you could just, again, waive these threats, even if you're more serious than before, and hope that the Cubans fold simply at the prospect of having to go up against the US. Now, there are some true believers on the island. There are people who really believe in this ideology of the Cuban state, this communist ideology. I was there about 10 years ago, and it was fascinating to talk to Cubans at the time. I was there briefly, but it was just a place that even back then felt like it was just being held together by band-aids. And yet many people that I spoke to, again, this is a place with a lot of secret police, right? But they were unwilling to criticize the Castros, and some even praised much of what the regime had done over the decades, saying, that their families were able to get education and things like that because of the ideology of the regime. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether that really was the reason, or whether Cuba would have been in a much better place had it adopted a different approach. But even back then, economically, it was just so clearly so weak. And so it's a situation where maybe the US is thinking we have a wide number of things we could do, and even just the smallest move might potentially lead the regime to, agree perhaps that its entire top echelon will go into exile, or something like that. But then you have to have a day after plan, and that's probably a whole other radio show.
Well, one thing that the U.S. has done, just yesterday, a U.S. aircraft carrier arrived in the Caribbean amid the tensions with Cuba, and we did see something similar happen earlier this year as the situation in Venezuela was ramping up. Any indication on what this is meant to signal?
I think it's meant to signal possibilities, right? We're there. We can do what we want. We have plenty of American firepower in the region, contrary to a lot of beliefs. Just because we are fighting this war in Iran, that doesn't mean we can't operate elsewhere. The United States' military is set up to be able to carry out more than one confrontation at a time. And Cuba is 9-10 million people. It's small. We have been watching them and checking out their capabilities for decades now. I'm not saying it would be easy, but I think it's more just saying, hey, guys, we're the superpower here. And this administration in particular is keen on showing American might in the Western Hemisphere. And so this is part of that.
I want to ask you about the Trump administration's motivations here, the president and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. But first, we're getting a couple of texts on this and calls just to talk a little bit more about the 1996 shooting down of the plane piloted by those Cuban Americans. Here is Laura in the Bronx, who's going to represent these callers and texters. Hi, Laura. You're on WNYC. Hi.
Thank you for taking the call. Look, I've heard it reported, and I'd like clarification on this, that the planes that were shot down, I think there were 3 planes, 2 of them were shot down. They were not out just over the ocean. They couldn't have been because they were leafleting Cuba. If they're dropping leaflets over the island, and granted, the situation between the U.S. and Cuba has been full of animosity, but it seems to me that if they were actually dropping leaflets, not just rescuing people in the water, this is not just a humanitarian mission, as it's been described. They were also taking a very aggressive stance, and it seems to me that they were on their own recognizance with regard to what happens to them. They were taking their risks, and they got caught, and it's kind of on them. That's not an American action. It wasn't anything sanctioned officially by this government. If the Russians decided they wanted to leaflet New York, we wouldn't like that very much. We might shoot down the plane. In fact, we did shoot down a Chinese weather balloon, right? it's unofficial invasion, so there's a little bit of truthfulness that it seems to be lacking, unless you want to dispute the fact that they were actually leafleting the island with political propaganda.
Laura,
can you comment on that?
Laura, thank you so much for your call. And Nahal, I know you're foreign affairs correspondent for Politico. I mean, when you're not covering Cuba, you're covering Iran, covering, it's been a very, I think, fair to say, busy year for you, covering the Trump administration's actions in other countries. But I think it's a fair point that Laura is raising and some other callers are raising that goes back all the way to 1996, Clinton era, Brothers to the Rescue, whose initial sort of goal was to, I take it from NPR reporting, was to disseminate information, help people who were fleeing Cuba after the Soviet Union collapsed, another energy crisis that caused a lot of hardship for the people of Cuba. And then their sort of goals and aspirations changed. And so I guess my question to you is just sort of how this justification is playing out in terms of the Trump administration. I mean, what are they saying about it so many years later?
Laura raises a very good point, and I'm going to just be super honest here. Like, I cover things so broadly that I'm not deep versed in the details of exactly where these planes were and exactly what they were doing. I'm not even going to pretend that I am an expert on this particular case. So it is entirely possible that the facts are very much in dispute and that there was the Cubans, I can tell you that the Cuban embassy and others insist that they were violating airspace and that they had the right to shoot these planes down. So I want to be clear, I'm not like a super Cuba expert. Has a very long history, and it's fascinating to learn about. But yeah, it's a very tricky case now, but it's also very political too. And I think the bigger point that the caller made is that it's a question of sovereignty, right? And it's a question of what you can do to another country and what they are allowed to do for themselves, right? And so the Cubans constantly talk about this when, they're like, look, sure, we're a small country and you're a superpower, but we still have rights. We still have, we could be in a much better place if the U.S. had not imposed this embargo on us for decades. They refer to it as a blockade. When Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and others go out there and they say, all of the problems Cubans are having are because of the mismanagement of the regime's response is, well, no, we would have done a much better job if you had allowed us to have, an unsanctioned economy, if we could have done business with other countries. But you did everything you could to tie our hands, and they see that as a violation of their sovereignty and what they're allowed to do. We see echoes of this in Iran and in other places as well. The U.S., for instance, wants Iran to significantly reduce or get rid of even its ballistic missile program. And the Iranians say, wait a minute, we are a country, we get to defend ourselves, we get to have sovereignty. So again, bottom line, the details of this case, I would urge people to learn about them for themselves. I am sure that there are court records, things like that are worth delving into, probably even books. But the bigger question of sovereignty is a really important one, and I'm really glad that Laura brought it up.
Nahal, as I said, I wanted to ask you about the Trump administration's motivations here. So let's begin with what the president has said. Here he is speaking to reporters on Tuesday.
I am very prone toward the Cuban Americans. They've been incredible people. Many of them have lost family members. They've been very badly hurt themselves. They've been in prison. They've come to this country and they've been very successful. The Cuban American people in Miami, they are amazing people. Most of them are in Miami, in Florida, but mostly in Miami. I'm very, very prone to helping them. I think I got 97% of that vote.
So a pretty clear explanation, at least from the president there. I mean, his Cuban American supporters that he frequently rubs elbows with in southern Florida wanted this. For our listeners, can you explain sort of the long push of the Cuban diaspora and its children and its grandchildren for intervention?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Cuban Americans, first of all, they live all over the country. And they're like any diaspora, there are differing views. Let's not forget that when President Obama led the diplomatic opening to Cuba 10 years ago, there was actually a lot of acceptance within the diaspora of that. There were some people who did not like it, but there were others who said, yeah, fine, we need to engage Cuba. And then President Trump reversed that. But look, when it comes to the active groups, the Cuban American activists who are very strong in Republican politics in particular, who I mean, one of my colleagues was talking to me about how some of them will wear capes with pictures of Trump, as how much they love him. They are very strong in Miami, and Florida is a very important state for the Republican Party. And so it does absolutely affect Trump's thinking and decision making. So the diaspora does have that influence politically. And in many ways, what's fascinating about this is whereas a place like Venezuela has oil or other resources that might make it more attractive for a president like Trump to take an interest in, or a place like Iran, poses this incredible danger of potentially wanting a nuclear weapon. And this is something that the U.S. has long said it would not tolerate, not just this particular president. The Cubans, the question is, why go after Cuba? They're not that much of a national security threat, although the administration insists that they are because they're friendly with Russia and China, but a lot of countries are friendly with Russia and China. There's some questions about how much they're hyping that element up. But, they don't have a lot of natural resources and things like that. And so often when I ask people, it's like, well, why Cuba as opposed to, say, Nicaragua, another kind of authoritarian state in this hemisphere? They say, well, it's the political aspect. It's the fact that the Cuban diaspora is so powerful in Republican politics. And that is kind of what is making the difference and tipping the scales for action in Cuba for Trump.
Speaking of Cuban Americans in politics, there's Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants to this country. He's been pushing for U.S. intervention in Cuba for decades. And you trace an interesting arc in Secretary Rubio's public messaging on this. Early on this year, he emphasized economic reform. Now he's talking about getting rid of the, quote, people in charge. And I want to play you a clip of Secretary Rubio from earlier this week, in which he actually addresses the Cuban people directly in Spanish. We'll play the clip, and then I'll translate for our listeners who don't speak Spanish right after.
La verdadera razón por la que no tienen electricidad, combustible ni alimentos es porque quienes controlan su país han saqueado miles de millones de dólares, pero nada ha sido utilizado para ayudar al pueblo.
Here it is in English. He says, the real reason you don't have electricity, fuel, or food is because those who control your country have plundered billions of dollars, but nothing has been used to help the people. Nahal, you want to talk to us a little bit about what at least Secretary Rubio is referring to there? I mean, who are the people in power?
He's talking about the regime, the political leaders, but also in particular the military institutions, the security institutions. There's this organization known as GAESA that has a tremendous amount of influence in terms of the economy. And he's making the case that, look, it's not America that is causing these problems right now. It's because you've had these corrupt rulers and leaders who steal all the money and they don't know how to run an economy or a proper government. Look, there's definitely, corruption and mismanagement in Cuba. But of course, the response to that from the government is, well, no, it's America that's imposed an oil blockade on us and prevented us from getting fuel for months, and with the exception of one Russian tanker. And that's why our hospitals cannot operate right now, and we can't refrigerate medicines, and we can't store food, and we have 22 hours a day of blackouts. That's why. It's not because of us. And this is partly, I think, about Rubio wanting to ensure that if this continues, that the Cuban people blame their leadership and not America in the event of things getting even worse.
Here is a caller who I think will reflect some of that. Anne on the Upper West Side. Hi, you're on WNYC.
Hi, thank you. I am a research scholar who's been to Cuba on research trips 6 times since 2010. I would say in 2010, the country was struggling, but it was functional, and you had basic services like medicine and education and basic transport available for people. They were worn down, but Obama made them helpful. The last time I was there, they were in a state of absolute desperation. There are food shortages. There are people who are actually suffering from malnutrition. So what changed over that period of time was U.S. policy, because previously they were getting support from other countries, including Canada, Western Europe, as well as China and Russia. So it was coming in, but the U.S. has really closed down those pipelines. I think the most moving conversation I had last time was with 2 physicians from a children's hospital outside Havana. They were not able to get antibiotics for seriously ill infants. They were not able to get bandages for children's wounds. They were in a state of total desperation, and it was the United States cutting off those supplies that put them in this situation. So in humanitarian terms, this policy has been an absolute disaster.
Anne, thank you so much for your call. Nahal, what are you hearing in Anne's call there?
I think she has a point. I think what's interesting about the era of Donald Trump is multiple things can be true at the same time, sometimes even when they contradict each other. It's possible that, yes, I mean, without question, U.S. policy has affected what's going on in Cuba. But then there's the argument that also Cuba, the regime has made a lot of mistakes. I don't know enough details about this, but my understanding is they made some really bad choices during the COVID crisis economically, and so people are suffering partly as a result of that. Some people I've spoken to say that people who 10 years ago were very supportive of the opening that Obama wanted are increasingly now today very dismissive of such types of approaches and engagement, and they just say, look, this regime is just corrupt to the core and it absolutely has to go, no matter what suffering people will have to endure along the way. And it's the type of thing that I think, that's why we have people like your caller who do this type of research, and historians, and the type of moral questions that we're going to have to grapple with for a long time.
And we leave it there for today. Nahal Toosi is Politico's senior foreign affairs correspondent and columnist. Nahal, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been great. Thank you.